Good afternoon, and a warm Doha greeting to you from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. I'm Mehran Kamrava. One of the most vexing issues about Iran has been its foreign policy in general, and particularly the changes that Iranian foreign policy has experienced over the last decade or so. We have seen fundamental changes in Iranian foreign policy from the radical, rhetoric-filled foreign policy of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad from 2005 to 2013 to a supposedly more moderate and more temperate foreign policy pursued by President Hassan Rouhani and his foreign minister Dr. Mohammad Javad Zarif. This foreign policy and the changes that Iranian foreign policy have made resulted first and foremost in the signing of the nuclear accord between Iran and the Western powers plus China and Russia in 2016, and then of course the United States pulling out of that nuclear accord in 2018 under President Donald Trump. So we have seen a heightening of tensions between the Rouhani administration and the United States, and also we have not seen the anticipated improvements that many had hoped between Iran and its Arab neighbors, particularly here in the Arabian Peninsula. Helping us better understand and navigate these changes in Iranian foreign policy as initiated by President Hassan Rouhani, particularly in his first term, is my good friend and colleague, Professor Luciano Zaccara, who is Research Assistant Professor at Qatar University and editor of the very recently published book, The Foreign Policy of Iran under President Hassan Rouhani's first term from 2013 to 2017. Professor Zaccara is an expert on Iran. He has done extensive research on Iranian foreign policy, and without further ado, I turn it over to Luciano.
Well, thank you very much. Professor Kamrava, it's a pleasure to be here in the Arab Center, and of course being with you. It's a pleasure to be invited to discuss with you our book. Our book on Iranian foreign policy in the first terms of Hassan Rouhani, which is a book that is a result of a project and a grant that I got from Qatar University to analyze the performance of the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and its impact on the Gulf region. Why this project, or why this book? Why we decided to have a book about one specific foreign policy term? Because the first 4 years were very important in providing some information about the capacity of elected presidents in Iran to change some aspects of the foreign policy and to provide their own mark, their own label to the periods in which they were president since the times of Rafsanjani until now. If we remember the previous presidencies, Rafsanjani's, Hashemi Rafsanjani's period from 1989 to 1997, he will be remembered by the reconstruction of the Iranian economy and foreign policy. Mohammad Khatami between 1997 to 2005 will be remembered because of the Dialogue of Civilizations initiative. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad will be remembered by his extreme third worldism and also with the confrontation with the West that drove Iran into the sanctions by the United Nations Security Council. So the idea was to inquire about what would be the legacy of Rouhani's first term, having in mind the big developments that happened in the first semester of his presidency, which was this first event that for the first time there was a direct conversation between President Obama and President Rouhani in New York in November 2013, after the United Nations General Assembly meeting, a conversation that was held while Rouhani was driving, well, not driving himself, he was going to the airport to leave the country. This is a way that both United States and Iran decided to show it to the press. And this marked the beginning of a direct conversation for the first time after 30-something years between the United States and Iran. How this finished with the picture that I always show to my students in class, which is a picture of John Kerry, the Secretary of State of Obama, and Mohammad Javad Zarif, with the two flags, the Iranian and American flag, behind them. So this picture that took place with the signature of the JCPOA, unfortunately, will be difficult to see it again. But I think that this picture marked the most important legacy or takeaway of this first term of Rouhani, and all the derivations that we can learn from this period. What we argue in the book is that these changes were, this drastic change in Iranian-American relations was possible because of the change in the Iranian approach towards the U.S. Political system considered that it was not a taboo anymore to directly engage with the United States to solve one specific issue, which was the Iranian nuclear program, but also because of the change in the U.S. approach towards Iran. With Obama, for the first time, the Khamenei's fatwa against the use of nuclear weapons was considered legally binding for the Iranian political system, and therefore it was acceptable to start a negotiation, because if it was binding for the political system, it was also binding for the design of the Iranian foreign policy. So this finished, we all know, with the signature of a nuclear deal that was proclaimed as a real achievement in diplomacy. For the first time, a long-term controversy that affected almost the whole world, with the involvement of the United Nations Security Council, ended only using multilateral diplomacy, engaged in the European Union, engaged in all the members of the Security Council, engaged in the US, and without shooting any bullets. This, of course, was, as I said, the result of the changes in both approaches. But also, we think, along the book, you can see that the overstress of the foreign policy, and specifically the JCPOA, the signature of the JCPOA, made other issues not to be considered in a right way, for instance, economic issues or social issues, or even some sectors of the Iranian foreign policy that they were not addressed in the proper way, because the Iranian presidency was 100% focused in solving this main issue along the first term. The pragmatism that Hassan Rouhani implemented in his presidency focused, some people say that too much, on nuclearization. And one aspect that we have to bear in mind, that this book is dealing with the first 4 years of Rouhani, the first term, but in the third year we had the election of Trump, that of course later on will change all the achievements that Iran got after the signature of the JCPOA. But of course this will be in our second book that we already started to work about on the second presidency of Rouhani. So stay tuned, because we will try to present this book again shortly. On that regard, on regards to Trump, we can say, or it is mentioned in the book as well, that Trump election was not influential in the re-election of Rouhani in May 2017, which is where this book ends, because Rouhani was still able to capitalize on the nuclear deal along his campaign. Trump was claiming that the deal was not good, it was the worst deal ever signed by the United States, but however, he remained within the deal until May 2018. So the foreign policy analysis of this term still is considering the potentialities of the American decision, but without entering into too much detail about what happened later on. In order to understand the Iranian foreign policy, one of the main things that we decided to do is to incorporate a debate about Rouhani foreign policy doctrine. We dedicated 2 chapters by 2 colleagues, Mahdi Yahoui from Iran and Ali Fatullah from Germany, to analyze the thinking of Rouhani, and in order to understand if there was foreign policy doctrine from Rouhani different than from the previous president. And the fact is that in these 2 chapters you can see a very interesting debate about different school of thoughts that Zarif and Rouhani tried to learn in order to implement Iranian foreign policy during this term. The problem is, according to one of the authors of Mahdi Yahoui, the constructive interaction that Rouhani tried to implement in his presidency was never designated to any case beyond the nuclear deal. So one of the things, of the contents of the book, is that the JCPOA absorbed much more of energy than anything else in policy design in Iran. Moreover, and despite the necessity for dialogue and cooperation in the region, Rouhani did not have any specific agenda or action plan to solve particular issues in the region, as one of the authors says as well in one of his chapters. On the other hand, Ali Fatullah mentioned the defensive realism as the school of thought that Rouhani implemented, that places security concerns as a priority, which actually contradicted the continuation of the offensive realism regional policy that was implemented by other elements of the political system in regional affairs. And this contradiction between these 2 school of thoughts, or 2 ways of understanding foreign relations, made this rapprochement to the US, which was the main priority in Rouhani's foreign policy, to be contradicted with the expansive regional policy that was implemented by Iran in certain scenarios, which at the end of the day hindered the overall Rouhani's strategy of engagement, mainly with the West. After these 2 main chapters we had, we dedicated some of the chapters to analyze regional aspects of the Iranian foreign policy. We had 1 chapter which was written by me and by Mehran Hagirian about the Iranian relations with the US, and specifically to the JCPOA, which I said for us was the main aspect which Rouhani dedicated most of his efforts, and to some extent this shadow other achievement that could have been highlighted during his term. One of this specific chapter is dedicated to the relation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. As you know, it's one of the most controversial relations that Iran has with other Gulf actors. And to some extent, Shahram Akbarzadeh, a professor that contributed to the book, says that the sectarian label that is always attributed to the Iranian-Saudi relation does not have an absolute explanatory power to make sense of the underlying fault lines between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that it simply masks the deep state anxieties and leadership aspiration. This doesn't mean that there is no sectarian dimension in the confrontation between the two states, but that the leadership or the competition for leadership in the region is what drives mainly the relation between the two states, and which made, mainly after the signature of the JCPOA, much more complicated the relations between Saudi and Iran, mainly because of the threat perceptions that Saudi Arabia started to have after the signature of the JCPOA. Something which is not included in the book, but of course is part of the overall analysis we do about this, is how the signature of the JCPOA highlighted the threats or the concerns in the GCC states, and how this drove to more assertive policy, at least from the Saudi side. Another chapter was dedicated specifically to the Iranian involvement in Syria and Iraq by Edward Wastnich. I always make a mistake by pronouncing his name, so sorry about that. And what Edward was saying is that, of course, the way Iran approached to the two cases was mainly related to the Islamic State that represented, by the time Rouhani was in power or arrived to power, the main security threat concerned. This showed two things. First, that Iran wanted to have or achieve long-term engagement or enduring engagement with both countries as a result of the direct Iranian involvement in the two conflicts to fight against ISIS, that the Iranian contribution to fight against ISIS was really determinant to eliminate this problem. And on the other hand, that it showed the limitations that the President Rouhani had in designing the Iranian foreign policy in regional environments. That actually the Iranian foreign policy is not designed exclusively by the president, but also by other actors like the Supreme Leader or the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, in regional scenarios. Then we had other articles dedicated to other aspects of the Iranian foreign policy, the relation between Iran and Russia, which was written by our colleague from Qatar University, Nikolai Koshanov, where he stressed the importance of the two main aspects that contributed to the improvement of relations between Iran and Russia during the time of Rouhani, which were the signature of the JCPOA. I mean, Russia was fundamental in getting this signed deal as well, and the engagement in Syria conflicts, with, according to Nikolai, represented the maximum potentiality of Iran-Russia relation until now. That was achieved at the end of the President Rouhani first term. To end, we have another two chapters that they were dedicated to aspects of Iranian foreign policy that they received a lot of attention in the first term during the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad period, because Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was heavily focused in reaching out with countries in Latin America and Africa. But at the end of the day, these relations with both African and Latin American countries did not survive after Rouhani's arrival to power. Basically because Rouhani's priorities, as we mentioned along the book, were exclusively or mainly the focus on solving the nuclear issue. All the efforts, diplomatic efforts, were concentrated on that. And in order to get that, what Iranian needed to do was to get first direct conversation with the United States, strong support from China, Russia, and the European Union. And Africa and Latin America were not in that picture. So the two chapters, one by Sergio Moya from Costa Rica, and the one on Africa by Manjoub Soueiri from Qatar University and Aliou Manjang, also from Qatar University, also reflect that reduction in the Iranian interest in both scenarios. However, we have to say that these two chapters represent unique cases of analysis of Iran relations with both areas during the President Rouhani's time. As I said, a lot of literature was written about Iranian engagement with Africa during the times and Latin America during the times of Ahmadinejad, but not many things were written about the Rouhani presidency or why Rouhani decided not to dedicate that many efforts in those two big group of countries. To end, I mean, the conclusions of these books were written by Anush Ehteshami, a prominent scholar in the UK, specialized in Iranian foreign policy. And I think the title was more or less the conclusion of the whole book, From Isolation to Accommodation. And in this conclusion, Professor Anush clearly explained how with Hassan Rouhani, there was a new era of prosperity and openness, at least in the first 3 years, in which Rouhani absolutely cut with the previous foreign policy orientation that Ahmadinejad was impressing in his foreign policy, which at the end of the day shows that presidents can make changes in the foreign policies despite the limitations of the political system, a political system which, you know, is led by a supreme leader that, according to the constitution, is the supreme authority, not only in internal politics but in foreign policies. The problem is that this prosperity and openness that happened in the first 3 years were shadowed by what happened later on. Lack of achievements in terms of benefits obtained from the JCPOA on one hand, lack of internal changes. I mean, while there was a focus on JCPOA, this was not translated into changes at the social and economic level, which made complicated for the JCPOA to really obtain all the benefits that they were expected. And secondly, of course, what happened with Trump victory in the United States that made almost impossible to think about a second term in which Rouhani could have enjoyed more benefits from the nuclear deal. What Anush is saying at the end is that still Iran, in the last sentence of the very last sentence of the book, is that Iran still needs to implement some policies, both internal and internal, that would make Iran to abandon this situation of permanent transition that we have been talking about since the times of Rafsanjani. I mean, every time we discuss about Iran's transition towards something else, with Rafsanjani towards normalization, with Hatami again towards normalization or embedment of relations with the United States and Europe, with Ahmadinejad transition towards something different, and again during Rouhani we are still discussing about Iranian transitional policy towards something that we still don't know exactly what is it. This is more or less the content of the book. I mean, this is like a movie. I will not tell you everything which is in the book, because otherwise you will not buy it and you will not read it. And what we want is you to engage in reading the book and discussing whenever you have the chance to do it. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mehran, for your invitation again.
Thank you, Luciano. I appreciate it. This is excellent. It's a very timely book and a timely discussion. And as you mentioned, Iranian foreign policy, particularly under Presidents Rafsanjani, Khatami, and Ahmadinejad, have been extensively discussed. But Rouhani's foreign policy, at least in a book text, in a book context, hasn't necessarily been discussed as such. So there's a couple of questions from the audience, but let me first ask, Iranian political system is often perceived, and often rightly so, as highly ideological. To what extent does this ideological nature of the political system translate into foreign policy, particularly under Rouhani?
Well, very interesting question. Of course, the discussion about ideology or pragmatism being the main drivers of Iranian foreign policy have always been there. What I always discuss in my class with my students, and I think it's also mentioned at some point in the book, is both always have relevance in the Iranian foreign policy making. However, there are periods in which ideology can be more important as determinant of some aspects of the Iranian foreign policy. We remember how Ahmadinejad recovered some aspects of the first Khomeini in some aspects of the export of the revolution, or criticisms toward Israel, etc., etc. There is always an ideological justification for all the pragmatism, we have to say. That you will never find something in the Iranian foreign policy that, according to the Iranian policymakers, is against the Iranian, the Islamic Republic ideology, and vice versa. So both are part of the equation. Both equally represent elements that contribute to create the Iranian foreign policy. None of them are above the other. And there is always an explanation in ideologic terms that everything that is done in the pragmatic way has an ideological explanation. Therefore, the Iranian approach towards the recent agreement between Israel and Emirates, or different regional developments that they always have, the Iranian response, can be interpreted as pragmatic discourses or narrative, but they are always embedded with ideological elements. So it's very difficult to divide that. This is a discussion we always have in class and in every debate, if ideology is more important. But I think we can reach the conclusion that both are equally important and interlinked.
Thank you. There's a question that says that President Khatami engaged Europe, and as a result, Europe switched its relations with Iran from critical dialogue to constructive dialogue. And has there been, and there was a retreat when Ahmadinejad came to office. Have Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif been able to improve Western position towards Iran?
I think yes. I think we have the evidence on how the at least European Union changed its perception towards Iran after Ahmadinejad left office. The very strong support that the different European negotiators, Catherine Ashton, Federica Mogherini, and now Josep Borrell, are providing Iran, despite all the criticism coming from and the pressure coming from the U.S., I think demonstrates that in the European eyes, Iran is not the same now that what it was during the times of Ahmadinejad. And this, I think, reinforced the idea that I mentioned before, that Iran is not a monolithic system, not even a monolithic political structure, that you have different elements and different layers with which external actors can also engage with. And Europe had a very good avenue for communication with Zarif and Rouhani. I assume you read already the Twitter by Josep Borrell when United States wanted to reinstate the snapback deal in the United Nations Security Council. Borrell was very clear, tweeting, "This is absolutely illegal. The United States, you cannot do that." So there was no hesitation in the European Union foreign policy towards Iran. What is the position that the European Union should take? And I think that this is the reflection of a very clear position of Europe, despite the fact that, of course, the Iranians are not happy with the lack of substantive efforts by the European Union. But I think that this reflects how this changed. And you can see also that in the press. If you follow European press, you will see that the way in which the European press was referring to Iran, or the Iranian right to enjoy some rights at the international level, absolutely changed comparing the previous period with Ahmadinejad and Rouhani.
Thank you. It's often assumed, Luciano, that there's a division of labor in Iranian foreign policy establishment between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the IRGC. That the Ministry of Foreign Affairs conducts relations with the United States, whereas the Revolutionary Guards handles Iranian foreign policy in its immediate vicinity. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that statement, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's more complicated. However, there are some elements that can give you the idea that, of course, the RGC have a more capacity or to interact in those more closer scenarios that will represent a real security concern for Iran. The way in which Iran approached both cases, Iraq and Syria, was of considering these two cases as the worst case scenarios in case that the states were defeated by Islamic states. So this way, what the Iranian narrative was expressing is that if we are defeated in these two scenarios, the next is us. So we will have the enemies on our borders. The way in which Iran approached these two scenarios made possible to the IRGC to be at the top, at the front line of any foreign policy decision taken in both scenarios. The most symbolic one, I think, was during the times of Zarif, when Assad visited Iran without informing the Iranian foreign minister that made Zarif to resign. Of course, then he was recovered, but this was analyzed as the confirmation from inside that something was decided that was not decided by the foreign ministry, but by someone else. And this, I think it made everybody to pay attention to how is the foreign policy decision-making structure and process inside Iran. Of course, Iran is not monolithic. Decisions in foreign policy are not monolithic, are more consensual, if you want to say, in different non-elective institutions that decide the Supreme National Security Council, the Discernment Council, the different councils that congregate different political forces. But in some of these institutions, sometimes the IRGC have more power than president, foreign minister, or other institutions. But yeah, it's a very complex process of foreign policy making, of course.
Thank you. Speaking of different institutions, one of the things we saw during Ahmadinejad's presidency was a very conflictual relationship between the president and the parliament, the Majlis. But we did not see that in Rouhani's first term, at least. Now we see it with the new Majlis that has come to power, the 11th Majlis. But the 10th Majlis had a different relationship with Rouhani than it did with Ahmadinejad. How was Rouhani able, or maybe his foreign minister, how were they able to change the relationship between the executive and the Majlis when it came particularly to Iranian foreign policy?
I think, I think it's very interesting because this gives me the starting point to explain that also the political system is complex in Iran, and we cannot talk about the monolithic political system internally. And that you can have this kind of conflicts between the different institutions. Ahmadinejad also in the second term, he had not very good relation with the leader. However, he was not dismissed. And there is something that it has been discussed lately with the new parliament if Rouhani would be impeached or not. Something that actually is not included in the constitution, so the Majlis cannot impeach the president, can recommend impeachment to the leader, and it's the leader who should impeach the president. This did not happen with Ahmadinejad, despite the fact that the parliament was not in good terms with him. So this is to explain how complex is the relation between the different layers or different institutions in the Iranian political system. The other point is that it is true, Rouhani was able to manage the parliament in the way that they did not block most of the legislation related to the JCPOA. But on the other hand, Rouhani's first term was the term in which more impeachment of his minister took place. I mean, compared with any other presidential period in Iran. So the parliament was harsh on Iran, on Rouhani, in many internal aspects. I don't remember exactly which was, I think 7 ministers were impeached or forced to resign. But they never attacked directly Zarif, or if they attacked, they were a minority group that they were not able to surpass that required quorum. Why it was possible to consolidate or to get this support? Basically because the head of the chair of the Majlis, Ali Larijani, was in favor of the Iranian foreign policy of reapproaching with the United States. I mean, not reapproaching with the United States per se, but achieving the JCPOA and trying to make Iran a normal state within the international community. We have to remember that also Larijani traveled to many countries while he was head of the Majlis. That it was not very normal in other cases. Haddad Adel or Imam Karoubi, they never traveled that much. Larijani was also having a kind of public diplomacy visiting other countries. So Larijani was engaged in the Iranian foreign policy, in reaching out and trying to break the Iranian isolationism. So that's why Iran was able to, or Rouhani was able to achieve that. The other problem is that some of the initiatives of Rouhani that were accepted by the parliament were blocked somewhere else. And this again shows the complexities of the Iranian political system. The parliament approved that. You remember the FATF, I mean, all the necessary agreements that Iran needed to sign regarding the finance of terrorism, money laundering, etc., etc. The parliament approved that, but then it was stuck in the Guardian Council. According to the Iranian legislative system, this needs to come back to the parliament. It was approved again, and then finally, after the second rejection by the Guardian Council, it went to the Expediency Council. The Expediency Council, which is a non-elective institution that acts as a third legislative chamber, blocked absolutely this initiative. So even though Rouhani had the support of the parliament, this did not imply that Iran was able to sign international agreements, because there were other institutions, non-elective institutions, that decided to paralyze or block or to reject the signature. Of course, now maybe it's too late to sign anything, because the parliament is already controlled by conservative groups that they will never support this kind of initiatives.
Thank you. There's a question that argues that the claim that the JCPOA didn't deliver the expected benefits to Iran might be related to the IRGC's activities outside of the country. And as a result, many argue that actually the IRGC utilized the money that Iran received after signing the nuclear agreement to finance its regional activities. So what do you think the impact of the IRGC's role is on Iran's foreign policy during Rouhani's term? Bearing in mind, as you just mentioned, that, for example, Bashar Assad went to Iran and was accompanied by General Qasem Soleimani, and Foreign Minister Zarif, as a result, resigned. And then, of course, he took back the resignation.
Well, I mean, it is very difficult to quantify which were the benefits obtained for in Iran because of the JCPOA. We will never have the right figure. I mean, Trump says that I don't know how many billions of dollars were transferred to Iran in Iran, so we didn't receive any money. I mean, actually, the signature of the deal did not represent a real transfer of money to Iran. And some people in Iran consider we don't need exactly, I mean, absolutely that money that was freezed in the United States, but we need to be able just to sell our oil, which was what Iran was trying to do since 2015 until now. So it's very difficult to quantify how much money Iran received and how much money was spent in Syria. I mean, there are many estimations, but none of them are really telling you which is the cost. I discussed this with many colleagues in Iran, and nobody was able to really to give me a real figure about. I mean, you know that there are a lot of, I mean, movement that's complain about Iranian. I mean, within Iran, that why we are spending money in Syria, why we have problems here. But again, which figures are we talking about? And nobody really knows if the Iranian experiment in Syria and Iraq are really costly, and the benefits that they are obtaining are compensating that. Iraq is the most important partner, economically speaking, for Iran in terms of export of oil, in terms of export of many different goods, in terms of pilgrimage, tourism, etc., etc. So the Iranian relation with Iraq is not 100% related to the Iranian influence or the Iranian engagement against ISIS. It's an economic concern, and Iran would do whatever it is in its power to extend this relation and to get benefit. But again, it's very difficult to quantify because most of or part of this trade is not registered. I mean, it's not quantifiable.
Thank you. To what extent did the foreign policy of President Rouhani change, if any, from his first to his second term, not taking into account the American withdrawal from the nuclear accord?
This is material for the second book, but however, I think not many aspects changed. Of course, I mean, there are a lot of analysis that said that now Rouhani had to be more aggressive in some aspects. But again, these changes happen because of United States withdrawal from the JCPOA. It's very difficult to find any aspect of the Iranian foreign policy that changed independently from that. Rouhani had an approach, whether it is right or not, correct or not, or it was focused too much on one specific aspect, disregarding the others, but at least he was coherent in some aspects. Normalization of relations with the West is fundamental to achieve Iranian's objectives in the region as a regional power. I mean, this is an aspiration, long-term aspirations of of Iran since the times of the Shah. It's nothing new. And reconstruction of the Iranian economy after the years of sanctions. What happened in the second term is Iran tried to keep the same objectives, keep good relations with the West and with the European, Russia and China, and keep fighting for the reconstruction of the country. The problem is you don't have partners. Most of the European countries retreat. China, proved until the signature of this 25 years deal, proved to be not 100% reliable partner when they stopped buying oil to zero, at least until in June 2020. So what other options Iran had in order to achieve those goals that they never changed? So yeah, of course, Rouhani had to become much more, narratively aggressive towards the United States, because it was necessary to do that. The resistance economy and all these narratives, but not because they changed their principle or their doctrine.
Thank you. We've been looking at Iranian foreign policy through the prism of Tehran. But we know that much foreign policy is also articulated in reaction to the policies of others or to regional developments, to other developments that are outside of the policymakers' control. To what extent was Rouhani's policy influenced by developments in places like Saudi Arabia, the rise of Mohammed bin Zayed in the United Arab Emirates, and of course the election of Donald Trump? But when it comes to this region, to what extent was Iran's foreign policy in relation to its neighbors influenced by developments in places like Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and elsewhere?
Well, I think, of course, the fact that King Salman became king in 2015 changed the Iranian perception. The relation that Iran had with King Abdullah was much better. At least we can say that it was not that problematic as it started to be once King Salman assumed power, and mainly when this JCPOA was signed. As I mentioned before, the JCPOA represented a huge concern, not only for Saudi Arabia, but generally speaking for the region and for the GCC states. So this made Iran to be aware that they were not well received in the region. I always said that we had an idea that the improvement of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia would happen after Iran reconstructed its relation with the US. And actually, it was the opposite. The fact that Iran signed a deal with the United States, or signed a deal including the United States, made the Saudi neighbors to be much more concerned than ever before. So Iran received that message. Okay, something that is supposed to ease the tension in the region, to make our relations better, is perceived as a threat, not as a way. Even though officially Saudi Arabia welcomed the agreement. So Iran had to consider other options. So if there is no good reception on the Saudi side, what we would afford ourselves to reach out more. In any case, Zarif traveled to most of the GCC with the exception of Saudi Arabia. So Iran tried again. Okay, we can't count on Saudi Arabia, but we are still counting on the other 5 GCC states. Some of them received him in a better way, some less. And of course, you have now a GCC that is having different approaches toward Iran. I can say that this is part of the way in which Zarif and Rouhani were dealing with the other GCC states, or at least is my thinking. And of course, we have a development here in Qatar with the blockade that made a clear Iranian position in this conflict, siding towards Qatar, or supporting Qatar in the blockade. That I think it is part of or it's a way to demonstrate how Iran approached its relation with the GCC state, despite confrontations that they had in the past. Iran and Qatar never had the same position in different scenarios in Iraq or in Syria mainly. However, Iran disregarded that and gave priority to the good relation that they had with Qatar. My understanding is that same would happen with Kuwait and Oman. Why not about Emirates, despite the fact of the signature of the deal with Israel the other day?
Right, right. To what extent, Luciano, is their awareness in Tehran of the deep existential fear that is pervasive here in the region in relation to Iran? You mentioned that after Iran signed the nuclear accord, they suddenly realized that the regional states fear them. Is there indeed this realization in Tehran? Or is there this assumption that why don't they understand us?
Yeah, well, I remember someone asked me about that. Why they hate us if we are treating them cordially and we are treating them, I mean, we want to have good relations with everybody. We want to have good relations. We want to reach out with them. Why they hate us? I assume that, I mean, and this was someone in a very high position, so in foreign policy level. I think at some point there is some kind of lack of knowledge about what is happening in the GCC states. The same way that in the GCC states there is absolutely lack of knowledge about what is going on inside Iran, and this idea that Iran is monolithic and the leader decides everything. I mean, myself and other colleagues, we are trying to demystify that. Okay, you don't need to reach the leader to do something. I mean, many things can be done or discussed or even agreed without reaching the leader. But I think that there is still not that realization that Iran is at least feared in the way that we can see in this side of the Gulf. The problem is this is also translated into the population. The population, they don't understand what is going on, why Iran cannot be well received as a normal state in the region and cannot be perceived as an equal in the region. But I think that this is part of the conclusion I'm taking from this book, is that with the Saudi Arabia change in 2015 in the government and the new, more proactive policy, one of the most important elements that Saudi tried to spread in the rest of the Gulf is that Iran is still the main concern because it is different and it will never be accepted as a regional power. So one of the elements to be recognized as a regional power is as acceptation of your neighbors. And Iran got this message that even though we are receiving the approval of the main power in the world, which is the United States, I mean, the United States recognized Iranian right of having nuclear energy within the JCPOA, which provides Iran strong elements to be considered as a regional power. Okay, but this regional power aspiration is not accepted by any of the neighbors. So if they are not accepted, meaning that whatever they do in terms of foreign policy will never be considered as a friendly, but a hostile policy from Iran. And I think that maybe in 2015, after this, Iran started to realize that that the fear that the GCC state or population have regarding Iran is much more deeper than what they thought. They thought that this was only at governmental level, but you can see that this can also be reflected into the population.
And is this therefore manifesting itself in the Hormuz peace endeavor hope that Rouhani and Zarif have been discussing extensively in various international forums?
Yeah. At the end of the day, the Hope Initiative. I was in the launching of this initiative in Iran. 2 days, 3 days after the killing of Soleimani. And of course, this changed the whole event. And I took the last flight from Tehran before the tragic incident with the Ukrainian airliner. So Iran tried to reach out with all the GCC states, and I think one of the most important elements of this initiative is that for the first time Iran realized, and this I think marked the Iranian realization that why they are concerned, that the previous, I mean, it's not the first time that Iran offered an initiative, a new architecture, defensive architecture, or security arrangement in the Gulf, including all the actors. But they were always saying without the presence of the United States. Of course, for Iran, United States is one of the concerns, the security concerns. For the GCC, it's part of the solution or part of the defense structure. So this was incompatible with the Hope Initiative, even though it is not very explicit, but it was mentioned by Rouhani in the United Nations, and it was mentioned again by another official in the presentation of this Hope, is that, okay, at the beginning, we can accept that the United States can remain in the region. By principle, we are against, but we understand that, of course, in order to please the security concerns of our neighbors, we need to allow them to have United States as an umbrella, protective umbrella. So I think this is demonstrating that Iran, for the first time, understood that there cannot be a security arrangement between the GCC and Iran because the GCC considers Iran as the main threat. But if there is another element that gives reassurances to Iran, it's possible to have an understanding. The problem is what happened during this day, the killing of Soleimani, the allegedly withdrawal of Saudi proposal that was, according to some sources, was sent through Iraq to Iran, etc., that everybody decided to stand by to see further actions. But according to Iran, the GCC says received the message. Whether they reply or not, this is something different, but they received the message after what happened in the summer last year in the Gulf, in different events that took place in the Gulf, and that for the first time Iran was able to discuss directly, honestly, and frankly about what do you need in terms of security to be safe and to trust us. But we don't know what is going to happen now. I think we have to wait until the next president.
And your argument is that, in the book in particular, is that despite Iran having what has been called a uniquely weak presidency, the president can actually change the direction of Iranian foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is not only the conclusion for this book, but for many things that I have been discussing since the times of my thesis, that the Iranian political system is so unique that despite the fact that political analysts or political scientists consider Iran as a monolithic and absolutely non-democratic state, you have democratic elements within the system that provoked or they can produce some changes in policy making, policy decisions. And the most salient elements of this policy making is foreign policy. And Rouhani demonstrated that. Ahmadinejad demonstrated that. Khatami demonstrated that. And even Khatami was, I mean, supposedly weak president in internal terms because he had a lot of opposition from the establishment, but however was able to impress his own mark and to leave a legacy about Iranian reapproachment with many countries, including with the United States. So can it be weak president in institutional terms with strong foreign policies? I think Iran is one example of that.
Luciano, two final questions. One is, as we approach the end of Rouhani's second term and the end of his presidency, how and in what direction do you think Iranian foreign policy is likely to evolve beyond Rouhani and Zarif?
I wish I could answer this question properly, but I mean, most of the people I talk to in Iran and outside Iran, analyzing Iranian foreign policy, of course, they predict that the next president will be a conservative. Whether it is a conservative, a neoconservative, radical, etc., we don't know, because the other of the Iranian, the interesting political elements in Iran is the elements in the political system is that you can have a surprise in the elections, that nobody expected Khatami to be president, nobody expected Ahmadinejad to be president. Some people expected Rouhani, but he was not the favorite candidate in the poll. So it is too early to determine who is going to be. Of course, the foreign policy will change. The parliament is already sided with the conservative groups. This means that the next president most probably will be conservative. Not only because the parliament changed, it's because of the disappointment from the pragmatic and reformist groups that they supported Rouhani. Some people told me that even if the reformists would not be vetoed during the legislative election that took place this year, maybe they would have lost because the people were disappointed with their performance. So reformist candidates were not very popular in this period, or people was disappointed that they would not vote for them. So most probably the next president will be conservative or moderate conservative, meaning that the policies would change a little bit. But since we don't know if Trump keeps saying that if he wins he will sign a new deal with Iran, this can be also a surprise. That I don't think the Iranians are against signing a deal with Trump. The problem is they want to sign a deal that is, of course, relevant for them and beneficial for them. The problem is the way in which Trump is setting the framework for this deal is not acceptable for Iran at all. But if you talk to some people in Iran, they will tell you, if Trump wants to take a picture and sign a deal, we can do that because we want to sign. We don't want to continue this situation forever. The problem is which terms that Trump is trying to impose. And the next president supposedly will be more supported by the parliament, by the different institutions. So he might have more power or more internal power to make decisions in foreign policy without the opposition of the other institutions. And this may be an element to confront the United States in a different way.
In support of what you just said, in fact, it was a very senior conservative politician who said, we want a win-win scenario with the United States. And he used the term win-win scenario with the United States, which was extremely surprising, but it also goes to support what you were just saying. Final question, Luciano, when the next book is out, will you come back and tell us about that book?
I count on that.
Okay, excellent. Well, we look forward to having you back. Congratulations again on the publication of this book. Best of luck to you with the next book. And my sincere thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation with Professor Luciano Zaccara. Have a good day.